The night spread across the valley like a black sea, swallowing the last shimmer of light from the dying truck that still hissed and spat tiny flames into the rain. The air was thick with smoke and oil, and the sharp sting of blood mixed with metal. Claire could taste it in her mouth as she tried to breathe, her chest rising in painful jerks. She could not tell if her legs were broken or crushed, only that they would not move when she commanded them, her hands trembling in the mud, her mind fighting. The urge to fade into the cold void that waited behind the pain. She had felt pain before, but never like this. Not even in training. Not even in the years when she had been forged into something more than human. The memory came uninvited, a whisper of sunlight and salt air, and the deep voice of her instructor, reminding her that fear is the first enemy and the last ally, and pain is the proof that you are still here. The rain poured harder now, drumming on her back like a war rhythm, and she lifted her head slowly, every motion sending shards of fire through her body. The sound of laughter drifted through the storm, distant, but real male voices, confident, mocking. They thought she was finished. They thought the mission was over. They thought breaking her legs would break her will, but Claire remembered the freezing nights on the deck of a ship, rocking in black water where the cold was sharper than any blade, and she had learned to move, even when her body screamed. Stop, she had learned. That movement was survival. She reached out, dragging herself toward the burning wreck, her fingers sinking into the mud, leaving behind streaks of red and black. Each breath was a knife cutting through her ribs, but she kept moving inch by inch, pulling herself forward, the rain washing away the blood that painted her hands. She tried to count her breaths to keep from losing consciousness. 1, 2, 3, steady like the old rhythm of her drills, the ones that had made her who she was. She remembered. Her team, their faces ghost-like in her mind, the laughter before a mission, the silence after she wondered if any of them were still alive, if any of them would know that she had fallen here alone in the storm. Her vision blurred, but the glow of the wreck guided her. It was her only light. The only sign that the world still existed around her. The truck was twisted and smoking, one wheel still spinning lazily like a cruel clock counting down to something she did not yet understand. She could feel heat on her face, and it felt almost good after the cold. The rain had soaked through everything, even her skin. The water carried dirt into her wounds, but she could not stop. She would not stop, because she could hear their boots crunching over. Gravel now closer than before. She pressed her face into the mud, closing her eyes and breathing shallowly, trying to listen more than she moved. The men were arguing. She could hear the edge of anger in one voice and the careless laughter in another. They were not afraid of her, not yet, and that was their mistake. They thought she was an ordinary target, something disposable, but they had never seen what she could do when pushed to the edge. She felt her pulse steadying, the pain dulling into a background hum, her body adjusting to the agony, like a machine rebooting through damage. Claire reached for the side of her vest, her fingers numb and clumsy. The familiar shape of the radio was gone, torn away in the crash. She cursed silently inside her head and kept searching until her hand brushed against something metallic, half buried in the mud. A fragment of the wreck, or maybe a weapon. She pulled it free. It was a piece of twisted metal, sharp on one side, dull on the other, small enough. To fit in her palm, she held it tight, the edge biting into her skin, giving her something real, something to focus on. She remembered a saying from training: when you have nothing left, hold on to something that hurts, because pain keeps you awake. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of engines down the road. Maybe theirs, maybe someone else, she could not tell, but it meant movement. It meant danger and opportunity. She dragged herself another few feet toward the shadow of the truck, the ground beneath, her slick and uneven, her body trembling from the effort. She wanted to scream, but she knew better. Sound was death. Silence was her only ally. The rain helped covering her movement, masking the sound of her breathing. She stopped when she reached the undercarriage of the wreck and pressed herself flat against the ground. The heat above her making her skin prickle. She could hear the men moving closer, their boots splashing in the puddles, their voices louder. One of them shouted something about finishing the job, another laughed again. She could picture their faces, the smug certainty that came from power unchecked. She wondered if they even knew who she was, if they had read her file, or if they just thought she was another disposable witness. Her thoughts began to drift. She could feel herself slipping into the darkness again, the edges of her vision softening like fog. She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, forcing herself back into focus. She could not afford to sleep. Not now. Not when. They were this close, she forced her hand to move, gripping the metal shard tighter. She needed a plan. She needed time, and all she had was pain and rain and the memory of every mission she had ever survived. She thought of the ocean again of the night. Dives, when the world was nothing but black water, and the sound of her own heart in her ears. She had learned then how to fight without light, without certainty, just instinct and breath. She closed her eyes and imagined that again, the rhythm of survival, the pulse that kept her moving forward. And when she opened her eyes, the firelight flickered on her face, and she saw something glint in the mud near her hand. A small device, half buried, maybe part of the radio, maybe a detonator, she could not tell. But it was something, and something was better than nothing. She reached for it inch by inch, her arms screaming, her vision spinning. She could hear footsteps now, so close she could almost feel their breath. She pressed her fingers into the mud wrapping, them around the device and pulling it free. It was cracked, but the light still blinked faintly red and steady. She did not know if it worked, but she held it to her chest like a heartbeat. The sound of boots stopped just beyond the wreck, and she froze, not daring to breathe. The men spoke again, their words muffled by the storm. One of them said, "Check the truck. Make sure she is gone." She waited, her heart pounding so loud she was sure they could hear it. She felt the vibration of their steps. Through the ground, the shadows shifting in the firelight. One of them crouched close. She could see his reflection in the puddle near her face, his hand reaching out to touch the side of the wreck. He was inches away. She tightened her grip on the metal shard. Her breath shallow, the storm roaring above, and then the man turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as if sensing something unseen. The rain slowed for a single heartbeat, and in that silence Claire knew she had one choice, one chance, and she would take it because she was not finished, not yet, not ever. The rain fell harder now, each drop like a needle against her skin, and the air smelled of smoke and rust. The wreck burned lower, its light flickering against the wet ground as if it too were struggling to survive. Claire pressed herself deeper into the mud, her fingers trembling around the sharp piece of metal she had found, her muscles twitching from exhaustion, the pain in her legs rising and falling like waves. She could hear the man still crouched beside the wreck muttering to himself, his breath ragged with frustration. He did not see her, not yet, and that gave her seconds, maybe less. She had learned long ago that seconds could be stretched into eternity if you knew how to use them. The voice of another man called out through the storm, sharp and impatient, asking if the job was done. The first man hesitated, muttered something back, then stood the moment his weight shifted. Claire rolled sideways into the darker shadow of the truck, her movement masked by thunder. The pain was a scream inside her head, but she did not let it escape. She bit her lip until she tasted blood again, her eyes wide and focused on the faint blinking light of the broken device. She had found she did not know if it would work. She only knew it might and might. Was enough, she turned it over in her hand, the red light pulsing like a heartbeat, and for a moment, she imagined it was her own. She thought of her training. Then the endless nights crawling through mud under barbed wire, the instructors shouting that hesitation kills. She had learned not to think only to act to trust the body. Even when the mind doubted, she could feel the same rhythm building now, the pulse of survival waking in her veins. She looked toward the men, 3 of them visible through the curtain of rain, their silhouettes shifting as they moved toward the truck. One carried a rifle, the others, flashlights, their beams cutting through the smoke. Like blades, they were close, too close. She needed distance. She needed a signal. Her thumb brushed the cracked button on the device, and the static burst in her ear through the small earpiece still half lodged beneath her hood. The sound made her flinch, then focus. It was faint, but it was something she whispered. A code, not her name, not her location, just numbers and syllables that only a few people on Earth would recognize. The rain muffled her voice, but the signal carried. She hoped, she prayed. To nothing in particular, that someone somewhere would hear it. Her breath fogged the air in front of her as she lowered the device again, her hands shaking. The red light blinked twice, then once, then stopped. For a moment she thought it was dead like everything else. But then another sound cut through the static, a faint echo, barely audible, a voice saying something she could not make out. Then silence again. She swallowed hard. The rain now. Mixing with sweat running into her eyes, she blinked it away. Her mind racing. If they had heard her, if they were coming, she had to stay alive long enough for them to find her. She gritted her teeth and began to crawl again, pulling herself along. The side of the wreck, her elbows digging into the earth. Each movement a battle between will and pain. The men were arguing now. One shouted over the storm that she could not have survived. Another laughed, saying they had seen the way her legs bent. No one walks away from that. Claire smiled faintly at the irony. They were right. She was not walking. She was crawling through hell. But she was still moving, still breathing. And that was more than they could imagine. She reached the back of the truck, where the mud rose into a small ridge. Beyond it, the road vanished into darkness and trees. She needed to reach those trees. The cover they offered the chance to vanish into shadow again. Her hands slipped in the mud as she pulled herself up the ridge, the muscles in her arms burning. She used the wreck as leverage, her fingers finding jagged edges of metal. The rain had turned everything slick. She almost lost her grip once, but the fear of falling back into their sight gave her strength. She climbed until she reached the top of the rise and flattened herself against the ground. Breathing shallow, her eyes scanning the darkness ahead, she could see the faint outline of the forest, and somewhere deep within it, a flash of light. Maybe lightning, maybe something else she could not be sure behind her. The men were closer now. One of them kicked at the mud. Another cursed as he slipped. Their flashlights danced wildly across the wreck and the ground around it. One beam passed inches from her face, and she froze, not daring to blink. She could hear her heartbeat pounding louder than the rain. One wrong breath, one movement, and it would be over. The beam lingered, then shifted away, and she exhaled silently. She began to crawl again faster, now dragging herself with raw desperation every inch, taking her farther from them, closer to safety, though the word safety felt meaningless now. Her mind drifted to her last mission, the one that had ended with betrayal. She saw flashes of faces, the briefing room, the handshake that had sealed her fate. She had trusted the wrong voice, and now she was here, broken and hunted, but she was not done, not yet. She reached the edge of the forest, the ground turning from mud to roots and leaves, the rain, softer beneath the canopy. She pulled herself behind a fallen tree, her body collapsing from exhaustion, her arms shaking uncontrollably. She wanted to rest, but the sound of footsteps behind her snapped her back. She looked up through the trees and saw faint beams of light moving closer. Claire knew she had to buy time. She reached into her vest, searching for anything that could serve as distraction, a flare, a charge, a blade. Her fingers found a small cylinder barely the size of her palm. He remembered packing it before the mission. A flash grenade modified for close quarters. She pulled the pin with her teeth, the metal cold and sharp, then threw it back toward the ridge. The men shouted as the forest lit up in a burst of white light. The sound echoing through the rain, she used the moment to move, dragging herself deeper into the trees, the roots tearing at her hands, the darkness swallowing her again. Her legs refused to move, but she forced her body forward using her elbows, her shoulders, anything she could. The sounds of confusion behind her told her it had worked. At least for now she reached a small stream. The water cold and fast. She dipped her hands into it, washing away the blood. Her reflection stared back, pale eyes, wide lips trembling. She barely recognized the woman staring back. But that woman was still alive, still fighting, and as long as she could move, she would not stop. She splashed her face once more, then pressed her ear to the ground, listening for pursuit. It was faint, but still their voices, shouts, the crunch of boots. They were angry now, hunting her. In earnest, she smiled again. A thin, determined smile. They thought they were predators, but they had no idea what kind of prey they were chasing. She dragged herself farther downstream, using the current to cover her trail, every movement, a test of willpower, her mind burning with fatigue, her body screaming to stop. But she ignored it. She could not stop. She would not stop, not until she found cover, not until she found a way to turn the hunt around. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, and beneath it she thought she heard something else, a low mechanical hum barely perceptible, but growing stronger. It was not thunder. It was engines, aircraft, maybe a drone, maybe something else. Her pulse quickened, hope flickering for the first time since the crash. She tilted her head, listening. The sound was definitely closer now, cutting through the storm. Her training told her to wait to verify, but her instincts whispered that it was them, her unit, the ones who had never stopped listening. She pressed the broken radio to her lips, whispering the code again, her voice raw from the rain and pain. Static answered, followed by a voice faint but clear, enough to make her heart stop for a moment. It said her call sign once, then again. Confirmation she was not alone anymore. Her breath caught. She looked toward the sky through the trees. The rain falling slower now. The darkness alive with sound and light, and behind her through the trees, the men shouted in alarm as the engines grew louder. Claire closed her eyes and let the rain fall across her face, her hand still gripping the shard of metal. Her other holding the broken radio. She knew rescue was close, but rescue never came without a fight, and she could feel the ground trembling as something heavy descended through the storm. She opened her eyes again and whispered to herself a single thought, one that had carried her through every mission she had ever survived. The worst is not over yet. The storm churned above the forest as Claire pressed her back against the cold earth. Her breath ragged, her body trembling from exhaustion. She could see the faint glow of the approaching lights. Through the trees, red and white beams cutting through the rain, her mind split between hope and fear. She knew the sound of the engines, the rhythmic thrum of rotors slicing air. It was them. It had to be her unit. But she also knew that the enemy was still close, their voices echoing through the woods, shouts mixed with the crash of boots over roots and mud. They were closing in, their weapons drawn, their confidence still high, because they believed she was too broken to fight. She reached for the small pistol still strapped to her thigh. It felt impossibly heavy, her fingers slick with blood. She checked the chamber by instinct. Though her vision blurred, she could barely see the metal, but the feel of it steadied her. It was familiar, like the weight of a promise. She crouched low, dragging herself behind the trunk of a fallen tree. The light from above grew stronger, the rain blowing sideways in sheets. She could almost make out the outline of the aircraft through the storm. She wanted to signal, but she could not risk giving away her position. Not yet. Not while the men were this close. Their voices were clearer now. One shouting that he saw movement, another swearing as he slipped. She could hear the click of a safety being released. They were moving in formation the way trained killers move. She had seen that formation before, used it herself on missions that had no names. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind sharpened. Pain was her weapon. Now pain kept her awake, focused. Alive! She pressed the radio to her lips and whispered the code again, short and clipped a request for extraction, with hostiles in pursuit. Static replied, then a voice confirming her signal inbound team. 2 minutes. 2 minutes could be a lifetime. In combat, she knew that she looked around scanning the terrain for cover. The stream to her right flowed fast and dark. If she could reach it, she could let the current carry her down toward the valley where the forest thickened. She pushed herself forward, biting back the cry that rose from her chest. Every movement fire through her legs. The men were close enough now that she could hear their breathing. One shouted again, this time closer, and she knew she had seconds. She aimed. The shot cracked. Through the rain, followed by a curse and then chaos. The others shouted, scattering, firing blindly into the dark. Claire rolled behind another tree, the bark splintering above her as bullets tore through it. She fired again, 2 more shots, and then silenced the sound of the rotors now almost above her, wind whipping through the forest. She looked up through the rain and saw the faint outline of the rescue craft, lowering its line, cutting through the storm. But before she could reach it, a figure burst from the darkness, a flash of movement, a shadow with a knife raised high, and in that split second, Claire understood that the rescue might already be too late toward the sound. Her hand steadied despite the trembling and squeezed the trigger. Once, the shadow lunged through the storm, his blade gleaming faintly in the flicker of lightning. Claire rolled sideways, the knife slicing air where her throat had been, her body screaming in protest, her legs nearly useless but her training moving. Faster than pain, she slammed her elbow into his knee. The crunch lost beneath the roar of the rotors above. The man stumbled. She twisted her body, grabbing his wrist, forcing the blade away. Her hands slick with rain and blood, the two of them crashing into the mud. His weight pressing down on her as he snarled something she could not hear through the thunder. His breath hot against her ear. The blade inching closer, she could feel the cold metal brush her skin, and then her hand found the shard of steel she had carried since the wreck. With a desperate surge, she drove it upward into the soft space beneath his ribs. His eyes went wide. His grip faltered. She twisted again, forcing him off her the knife.